Hi everyone and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. In a moment, our guest on Ukraine, political scientist who will talk a lot about what a future peace deal might look like, or a ceasefire. They are far, far away. First of all, the bird is free. That's what Elon Musk has tweeted on Twitter, which he now owns. And he's talked about it being free suddenly, like it wasn't before. And here's just a couple of thoughts from a simple journalist who's been doing this kind of work for more than 40 years. It's not complicated, or at least not as complicated as they want you to think it is. Freedom of speech comes with some restrictions, naturally. As a journalist, I can be sued for spreading disinformation. I'm personally accountable for regulating the statements I quote, for libel, slander, and I have a duty to try to broadcast truth versus fiction. It's not always easy to know who's telling the truth, so, at least you try to give balance by allowing the other side to speak too. But on Twitter, there is no mandatory balance. For example, if former President Trump tweets a nasty comment, unlike a mainstream media platform, Twitter won't seek out the other side for balance. Or under Musk's ownership, it won't remove the tweet or the person who wrote it, apparently. Trump will return to Musk's Twitter sometime around October the 31st, Halloween, the horrors. And soon will be spreading his expert disinformation, claiming regular stuff that he always talks about. The elections are stolen, and his hateful personal messages to millions. Other leaders too, like Iran's mullahs or Syria's Assad, or groups that are currently regulated, maybe soon won't be. That's bizarre. What if ISIS wants to start tweeting? Probably under anti-terror legislation, Twitter will find itself in a lot of trouble. How about white supremacists? Is Twitter going to remove them still? Or take them down? They better. Their advertisers will disappear. Musk has tried to reassure advertisers, saying Twitter obviously cannot become a free-for-all hellscape where anything can be said with no consequences. Twitter aspires to be the most respectful advertising platform in the world, he wrote. But Musk, who's good at making electric cars and rockets and he's not anyone's poster boy editor on issues of free speech. He's not a journalist. He's not somebody that I respect when it comes to regulating social media platforms. And his first act was to fire many executives who removed Trump from the platform and tried to regulate content on Twitter. It's got to be regulated. Content has to be regulated. The internet cannot be free to use for extremists, nor former presidents, if they're extreme, looking to spread untruths and ignite attacks on democracy. So let's see how it goes with Twitter. But free speech, comes with responsibilities. And let's see Twitter exercise those under the ownership of Elon Musk. On to Russia. Just before we get into this interview that we talked about on Ukraine, the Kremlin touted Russian leader President Putin's appearance on the Valdai think tank in Moscow as a major foreign policy speech to watch. I did. And it was heavy lifting to sort out Putin's long-winded, rambling ideas on the world and Russia's place in it. He rails against everything. Western liberal democracies. His interpretation of how sovereign nations were given land, including Ukraine and Poland now. He still thinks Ukraine is his, even if nobody else does. He claims that his war was only to free Russian speakers in the Donbass. But he, of course, never mentioned how in the opening weeks of the fight he tried to take Kiev and lost. Kiev is not in the Donbass. Oh, and Russia invaded Ukraine. It wasn't attacked. So Putin's claim only to be defending Russia is frankly ridiculous. Putin said one thing we can all agree on: it's a dirty and bloody game being played. And he may be right in framing what's ahead, the most dangerous and unpredictable decade since World War II, he said. Putin, who has repeatedly said Russia would use all its weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons, last night tried to turn it all upside down and accused the West of threatening Russia. We never intentionally said anything about the use of nuclear weapons, quote unquote. That's false. The Russians have been on television every night, at the Security Council. People like the former President Medvedev have been threatening to bury the West with nuclear responses. Anyway, it's interesting that Putin is a master at trying to tap into divisions in the West. He raised the issue of banning gay sex in Russia, saying it's all the creation of liberal democracies. And he plays to conservative audiences in America and Hungary and elsewhere by talking about the sins of gay sex and how Russia is fighting Satanism. I mean, Putin's pretty bizarre. He's a KGB person, and here's the term that I really think crystallizes what he does. He mirror images everything to confuse. He turns truths upside down to serve his purposes while clinging to power at all costs. Russia was attacked instead of it attacked Ukraine. The war is going according to plan instead of Russia's losing thousands of soldiers in the war and probably losing the war. Ukraine suffered a 2014 coup d'etat instead of a revolution where people rose up for change and to join the EU. Ukraine is making a dirty bomb, he says, instead of Russia, which may be ready to use one near Kherson. It goes on as the war grinds on. And what's dark is Putin's unwillingness to push on from his failed Soviet past and allow Russians and Ukrainians and Europe to live in peace. All right, joining me now from Kiev is Maria Zolkina, who is a political analyst with the think tank Ilko Kucherev of Democratic Initiatives. Hi, Maria. I hope I said all that properly.
Hello. Yes, you said it perfectly well.
How is life, just before we get into the politics of this, how is life now in Kiev with so many of these air raids and the drones? And people say, yeah, we've been in bomb shelters before, but suddenly the bomb shelters are very cold and very dark, and without electricity or heat, it's become much more difficult.
Actually, for people, it's another wave of, let's say, terror against them. So it is how it's perceived all over Ukraine, because especially when Russia started using the so-called kamikaze drones against civilian population and against critical infrastructure of Ukraine. So we understand that one of the main, let's say, goals of Russia is to make people panic and make them feel scared. But, you know, all over Ukraine, despite of almost unstoppable air alerts and riot sirens, so people are going to the bomb shelters, but still you can find lots of videos which are contrasting with the mood which was expected from wide public in Ukraine. So you can see people, you can watch like videos from schools, bomb shelters where kids are singing songs. So it's the mood of resistance, I would say, instead of panic and instead of chaos. And it's definitely not the mood to ask for a peace at any price, if that peace is at the cost of Ukraine's interest.
I want to ask you about that in a second. And I read your piece in The Guardian recently where you said, you know, peace at any price. No, and we'll get into that. But can I ask a simple question? Because a lot of people are confused in the West, and maybe they are in Ukraine too. Why did Russia back on February the 24th attack Ukraine? Because any way out of this you have to find out why Russia got into it. What in your view, was it NATO expansion? Was it threats from Ukraine? I mean, what is in the Kremlin's head?
In our opinion, Kremlin is pretty rational, but they follow their own rational logic. It differs from Western perception. So when it comes to Ukraine or when it comes to our partners, usually when we have some kind of foreign policy problem, we go into negotiations. And that was what actually Ukraine was pushing forward since 2014 when Russia first invaded, because according even to the International Criminal Court documents, their first invasion of Russia is fixed in Donbas in 2014. I mean, regular Russian army. So, and since that time, in the International Criminal Court documents, it's treated as international military conflict, by the way. But when it comes to the February 24th, Russia simply follows its, from their point of view, rational logic of expansion. Ukraine was always treated by Russia, even after 1991, as the country belonging to the area of influence of Russia. And Russia never recognized the sovereign right of Ukraine to decide about its foreign policy independently from Russia. I mean, at the same time, the reality was different because the public opinion in Ukraine was totally in favor of European Union accession. After 2014, the public opinion about NATO changed. I mean, people started in all the regions of Ukraine started supporting this accession of Ukraine to NATO. But from Russia point of view, Ukraine, on the one hand, is a failed state, as they say. That's one very important argument to keep in mind. The state doesn't succeed to be established and to function from Moscow point of view. That's why they do not want even to deal with Ukraine as an independent actor, as with a sovereign state. And when you deny the sovereign nature of actually your vis-a-vis, it's very simple to understand why they don't think they violate some red lines or cross some red lines by invasion of Ukrainian territory, actually.
Are you surprised by when you hear, first of all, Russian state television and some of the rhetoric on there where they speak about Ukrainians in pretty inhuman terms? I mean, this week they talked about, a commentator calling for the drowning of Ukrainian children. And then Security Council member Dmitry Medvedev is constantly on Telegram saying disparaging things about Ukraine, talking about the annihilation of Ukraine and the West too, by the way. And then, Ukraine being a vassal state. I mean, how does that play in Ukraine?
Ukraine got used to the Russian propaganda because we were dealing very closely with it for 8 years before large-scale invasion. So failed state, Ukrainians are not a separate nation, and they are just another Russians, as they say. So this is the very denial of the fact that we have our own culture, history, which is even more ancient than the Russian, this purely Russian one, let's say. At the same time, there is a political denial of our right to make sovereign decisions, despite we are independent for more than 30 years already. And that's why Ukrainians really were already vaccinated from this Russian propaganda after 2014, much better than the Western world was. But Russia still uses these narratives. And one of these narratives is that
it's narrative filled with hate.
Exactly. And actually, by using this hate speech against Ukrainians, it will be more easier for us, and it is more easier for us to explain to our Western or generally international audience that this is the war which has the genocidal nature. Because what we see now is that what Russia is doing right now, they are not just eliminating regular army on the battlefield in Ukraine. They are just trying to destroy the nation as it is. The first steps they are doing on occupied territories is to prohibit everything which is even symbolically related to Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history. They replace the teachers. They are bringing teachers from Russian territories or from previously occupied by Russia Crimea to teach our teachers how to teach children. That's what they are doing.
And in fact, some of those children have been taken from the occupied areas, and they've been put up for adoption or put in orphanages inside Russia.
It's another tragedy, and it's one. There are like 5 international criteria of genocide. and almost, actually not most all, as of now, it's 5 of them, which Russia proved to show, to demonstrate against Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil. And one of them is, of course, the treatment of Ukrainian children. The latest, very, let's say, vague assessments is that more than 500,000 of Ukrainian children were deported to Russia. The biggest tragedy happened in Mariupol, in the time when the city was bombed and then occupied by Russia, because from Mariupol and from Kharkiv region, they took children, brought them to Russian orphanages, or they started the specific procedure. You're absolutely right. Russia changed legislation, its own legislation, to make it easier to adopt exactly Ukrainian children by Russian citizens right now. And even the so-called ombudsman of Russia was, saying with honor that she is like leading this process, and then she is gonna adopt some of Ukrainian children. But the tragedy is that number of these children have their families in Ukraine, not only parents, which were, for instance, injured and lost somewhere, they have grandparents, other relatives in Ukraine, and this is the struggle where Ukraine has little support from international humanitarian organizations, because International Committee of the Red Cross, whose direct mandate is to deal with similar issues, is doing absolutely nothing, honestly speaking, about this problem, for instance.
People have to register 500,000 children to understand how big this isn't a busload of kids, which would be tragic enough. You're talking about several 100,000 children that were taken. Look, I want to ask you about something. 30 U.S. Democrats signed a letter urging President Biden to have direct negotiations with Russia to end the conflict. These are Democrats, not Republicans. Have already, in the House at least, been saying this: we can't go on writing a blank check to Ukraine forever. There has to be some kind of ceasefire. There has to be some kind of negotiations. Now you have 30, and some of them quite influential in the Democratic Party, saying it's time to talk to Russia. How do you see it? What is the risk of not talking to Russia? Do you see it the same as perhaps the U.S. does? And what is the risk you see in talking to Russia right now?
In talking to Russia, I see several risks. First of all, as an expert dealing with Russian-Ukrainian war since 2014, the very first question I put on the agenda is that whether there will be more security in Europe, around Ukraine, and in let's say, in close to NATO and around European Union, if there is a political deal with Russia right now. So from security point of view, there will be no guarantees that Russia will stop its aggression, because Russia is not going to withdraw its forces voluntarily from already occupied territories of Ukraine. It means that any political deal right now is in the interest of Russia to de facto legalize its presence on recently occupied territories, to make the international community not legally, but factually recognize that this territory belongs to Russia. What does it mean? It means that the military support to Ukraine, not only to conduct counteroffensive operations, but even to conduct so kind of defensive operations along the current front line, will be decreased. Because according to the logic of our partners, as soon as you go into negotiations, you should stop using, let's say, military instruments, not to blow up the hope for a political deal. And this is what Russia is hoping for, to drag Ukraine into some kind of negotiations. They will be absolutely fake. I will explain like a couple of scenarios in this regard later. But to drag Ukraine and the West into negotiations with a very clear short-term goal to make US, UK, Western European countries stop sending its military support to Ukraine, to make Ukraine not be able to return control over already occupied territories. And the main risk here is, of course, that this territory will be frozen as occupied by Russia. But the midterm, or even not midterm, because midterm is like about couple of years, but the very next risk is that this period of, let's say, a pause in the light of negotiations, in the light when military support to Ukraine will be decreased, will be used by Russia for regrouping, restructuring, and offending again, because we don't see any evidence they have changed their plans.
What would happen if President Zelensky suddenly said, yeah, okay, let's compromise, let's give them some territory for a ceasefire, some territory for peace? What would Ukrainians say about that, who have lost loved ones, who have sacrificed for now 8 months fighting Russia? Would Zelensky even be able to deliver that under pressure from the West if he wanted to?
Zelensky is absolutely not able to deliver this message. I don't even speak about his personal political, preferences. I'm speaking about the pressure coming from the largest possible number of people inside of Ukraine. So even in the times of large-scale invasion, we Ukrainian researchers succeed to conduct face-to-face or phone interviews, including, by the way, on recently occupied territories. And one of the facts we find out and prove with numbers is that about 80 up to 90% of people, first of all, believe that Ukraine will win this war. And that Ukraine, and the second important trend is that Ukraine should not surrender and should not sell out its territories. Moreover, I would say that before February 24th, Ukrainians got used to coexist with already occupied Crimea, and at that point, 30% of Donbass, which were also occupied. But after February 24, everything was brought to zero. And as of now, the demand is to make Russians withdraw from the entire Ukrainian territory, by military, because we understood that we failed to negotiate with Russia. And that's why Zelensky simply, even if he's facing the great pressure from the West, he will not be able, if he wants to keep his power inside the country, if he won't be treated not as a betrayer of national interest, he simply cannot say that we agree somehow to some territories belonging to Russia de facto. Moreover, even ceasefire, which Russia will be pushing more and more on the agenda right now, as a temporary measure needed for Russia to mobilize enough people, to regroup and to offend again, even this temporary fake ceasefire will be treated within Ukrainian society as some kind of a step back. And that's why Zelensky has no much space for maneuver.
Do you believe, and you're a political analyst, you're just not a Ukrainian, but you're also somebody who analyzes this. Do you believe that if Ukrainians say no way to a ceasefire until we get our territory back in the east, do you believe that they're willing to compromise probably in the end on Crimea?
As of now, it doesn't seem to be very realistic, but we have to keep in mind that compromise around Crimea is possible, but not about the territorial status of Crimea. That's very important. The compromise is possible for Ukrainians, is possible about the way how Russia will leave Crimea and give it back to Ukraine. So when you will follow the domestic discussion, you will find the very clear logic in Ukraine that Crimea should be returned to under the control of Ukraine, because it's basically the platform for Russia to invade anytime again. It's a military base. What Russia was doing is militarization of Crimea.
And certainly this invasion, a lot of it was launched in the south from the Crimea.
Exactly.
It was a launch pad for the Russians.
Exactly. And that's why demilitarization of Crimea is one of the things which is absolutely needed from Ukrainian security point of view. But at the same time, when it comes to negotiations, I believe that it is possible that Crimea will be returned under the control of Ukraine, not necessarily by military means, but maybe at some point by a diplomatic solution between Ukraine and Russia. Though from Russian point of view, neither diplomatic nor military solution is possible for Crimea, because this is the very foundation of autocratic regime in Russia, regardless who will be on the top of it, Putin or anyone else. And that's why Ukraine still insists that we have to have enough military support to be able to return Crimea militarily, or it doesn't make Russian forces completely withdraw or to be defeated on continental part of Ukraine, because the failure of Russia, defeat of Russia of continental part of Ukraine, will make Russia be more ready to negotiate about returning the Crimea to Ukraine. Because what's the key to winning over autocratic regimes? That they cannot survive military defeat. That's very important to understand. And as soon as
are we about to witness that military defeat of the Russian army?
Tactically, we have seen their defeats on several tactical directions where they tried to invade and even tried to fix their presence, like in Sumy, in Chernihiv, around Kiev, recently in Kharkiv region, which was absolutely great, sophisticated operations, which will be, studied by military staff all around the world. And at the same time, what we're seeing now is another counteroffensive operation in Kherson region, which is a bit slower than it was in Kharkiv. In Kharkiv, it was a rapid one, but in Kherson, it's a different geography, landscape, everything, and we still do not have enough, for instance, armored vehicles to go easily forward. That's why, yes, military defeat of Russia is absolutely possible. We proved that Ukrainian army, from capabilities point of view, from skills point of view, is it's manageable task for them, and that's why the complete failure of Russia on the battlefield is just the matter of time if Ukraine has a bit more military support than we have now.
A bit more? You've had a lot. So what
we have a lot, but
do you need?
The problem is not about the quantities of the same type of weapons. The problem is with some specific types of weapons which Ukraine doesn't receive and which are absolutely necessary if we speak about the complete liberation of Ukrainian territories. It's armored vehicles in enough quantities. Secondly, it's about heavy artillery, which should be not like in 20, which should not be counted as 20 or 30 HIMARS, but much more, at least twice more than we have now, because what these heavy artillery pieces are doing right now, they're just moving along the front line and striking, instead of being more, concentrated on a specific battlefield part. And tanks, which we are asking from the very beginning of counteroffensive. And the fourth important is important for civilian infrastructure, for keeping Ukrainian people more secure. It's anti-aircraft systems, it's anti-missile systems. So this is what we are asking about in larger quantities than we have been receiving so far.
What is this talk of a dirty bomb? Russia setting off alarm bells, telling everybody from America to Britain to France to Turkey that Ukraine is about to set off a dirty bomb. The West, in turn, sees this as a false flag operation. What is Russia planning next? What do you think this is all about?
At this very moment, I think that this is more likely as kind of another stage of the nuclear blackmailing, which Russia switched to in the middle of summer. If we just understand the general puzzle, then this step of Russia with so-called dirty bomb accusations of Ukraine would be very expectable. So being cornered or having no successes on the battlefield and controlling none of those 4 regions which were declared as the next to Russia, Russia has to threaten with much worse scenario, threaten Ukraine and threaten our European and Western partners generally with much worse scenario as possible. And this worst scenario is usage of nuclear weapons or any other weapons which which is prohibited, for instance, chemical or biological weapons against Ukrainians. And that's why we consider that at this very moment, Russia is mainly trying to threaten us. That we know that if they threaten us with the nuclear bombs directly, everything is clear for the whole world. But if they switch to more propaganda scenarios, accusing Ukraine of preparing some nuclear, nuclear explosions or using the other types of prohibited weapons, so it's another game. It's another game that they believe that someone might believe this scenario, that this is Ukraine doing something, but Russia fails actually, because neither in the western part of the world nor in the Middle East, people, wide public or governments believe that Ukraine voluntarily refused in 1994 from the third largest in the world nuclear arsenal, started preparing some kind of a dirty bomb right now, while begging the whole world to support us just to liberate our territories. That's all we want right now. And that's why this scenario fails. But I wouldn't be so certain that Russia wouldn't use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, that they would not organize some kind of provocations or explosions even on occupied by Russians since spring Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the second largest in Europe, a power plant.
Still under Russian control.
Still under Russian control, still with a very limited International Atomic Agency access to it. Couple of people remained there after the Grossi, the general director, went there with his mission. Couple of people stayed there, but they have left already. And after that, at the end of September, beginning of October, Russia just directly, also by Putin himself, increased the tensions and increased the threats of using the nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So that's why I think that in the face of complete military defeat, Russia might use nuclear weapons on a restricted area. So tactical nuclear weapons is not just like 1 kilometer. It might be huge destruction, really huge destruction, and large areas affected. But Russia might be thinking about using it exactly to cross all the possible, red lines. And after that, to say then, if you want to keep people alive on the other part of Ukrainian territory, so now you have no other way but to sit down with us and to talk under our conditions.
Nuclear blackmail, unthinkable 20, 30 years ago, but a frightening scenario. So Maria Zolkina, thank you so much for your time. And I should note that I was just watching the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who has now taken over the chair in Britain. And one of the things in his opening statements was that they will continue to support Ukraine until there is a successful conclusion to the war in Ukraine. So I think Ukrainians will probably take some note of encouragement in all of that. Although what is successful conclusions, that remains to be seen. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
And that's our backstory this week, mostly on Ukraine. Thanks for listening. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.